If you breathe in ammonia gas, it's immediately very toxic, so the eyes would start to water, your throat would become sore. It can cause chest pain, difficulty in breathing, and if you have enough of it, it can cause circulatory collapse and even death.
You had sulfur dioxide, which was extremely toxic, and then you had methyl chloride.
Only certain gases will turn from liquid to gas in the way required. Unfortunately, these properties also made them exceptionally dangerous. Gases like methyl chloride also had other uses.
This was an age of firsts. Innovations of the Edwardian era include such fantastical breakthroughs as the first powered, sustained, successful flight by a machine heavier than air, the first mass production of motor cars, the first vacuum cleaners and electric washing machines being manufactured in the UK. In other words, the Edwardians were laying the foundations of our modern world.
Lots of these were the big inventions that transformed life outside the home, but there were also the smaller items that made day-to-day domestic life easier and more comfortable, things we take for granted today.
All of the items and activities that the modern middle-class Edwardian needed could be bought from these pages. 100 years previously, most of them would probably not have existed, let alone have been available for mass consumption. It's in the kitchen that we find the greatest technological marvels of the Edwardian age, making domestic life easier and sometimes shorter. If you were really up to date and had money to burn, what could be more desirable than a brand new refrigerator?
Food preservation was a major issue in Edwardian times. Initially, they made purpose-built cold cabinets to store food.
They were carved out of timber, lined with sawdust, it could be rabbit fur, and then your item was put inside and packed with ice.
Ice was shipped in from the Arctic and distributed to people's homes, but no matter how well insulated, the ice would not last long.
They wanted some other way of doing it, and technology gave them the answer, I suppose.
So what came after ice? How did we get to the first fridges that used chemicals? To find out, I've come to South Bank University in London to meet refrigeration expert Professor Graham Maidment.
So, is this enormous thing an early fridge?
Yeah, it's an early invention of a fridge, dates probably about 1870, that sort of thing.
This unlikely-looking fridge has been rebuilt from early designs. It was never actually manufactured, but is perfect to illustrate the first attempts at refrigeration. When a version did come onto the market, it wasn't cheap.
The earliest commercial fridges, early 20th century, would have been about £700, that sort of price, and compared to a Model T Ford, which was maybe £500, so more expensive than a car.
So early fridges were the plaything of the Edwardian rich and did not become affordable to the masses until much later.
And how did it work?
Refrigeration uses the principle of evaporation of a liquid to gas to produce a cooling effect. And if I can show you the little experiment, in this can we've got some butane, which is a common refrigerant that we use today. If we spray it, you can see it actually produces cooling as it hits the surface and evaporates.
Well, yes. At first it's warm, but then it gets really cold very fast. The evaporating gas draws heat. This is how a fridge works. The Edwardian engineers understood they needed to create a cycle where a gas could evaporate, draw the heat, and return to liquid continuously.
The refrigerant would have been in this pipes here and would have made this small container within here cold.
Just this little thing in the middle here?
Absolutely. I know it's huge, isn't it? The whole machine is massive, just for a small amount of cooling.
Yes, you could have put a pint of milk in there and that's about it.
That's it.
What's all this then?
Well, that's basically making the refrigerant back to a liquid again. We've got a compressor that pumps it, This is a hand-driven one, so you'd have had a servant driving this.
That's a terrible job. That's awful. You'd have to be doing this all day, 24 hours a day, in order to keep that pint of milk cold.
Absolutely.
It took time for the technology to develop to cope with the chemicals they knew could work. This prototype was developed before electricity and well before rubber sealants.
You can see here, you know, the sort of components that we would have used, the refrigerant wouldn't have stayed within the system, so it had leaked out.
The trouble was that the early fridges weren't actually sealed fridges. So they used these gases and there would be a certain amount of seepage and leakage from these fridges.
And this is what made the early fridges so hazardous.
The dangers of the early fridges were actually in the chemicals that they used as the refrigeration.
The ammonia, which was pretty flammable and pretty toxic.
If you breathe in ammonia gas, it's immediately very toxic, so the eyes would start to water, your throat would become sore. It can cause chest pain, difficulty in breathing, and if you have enough of it, it can cause circulatory collapse and even death.
You had sulfur dioxide, which was extremely toxic, and then you had methyl chloride.
Only certain gases will turn from liquid to gas in the way required. Unfortunately, these properties also made them exceptionally dangerous. Gases like methyl chloride also had other uses.
They actually used gases that, in the First World War, unfortunately, used to gas people in the trenches.
He took ill after repairing a burst pipe in a refrigerator. Medical evidence showed that death was directly due to inhaling ammonia fumes.
If you have any length of period being exposed to these gases, then you can get frostbite on the inside of your lungs. Your blood can pool on your heart. You were talking absolutely lethal materials to be using in the fridge.
So not only were they poisonous, but they could be a fire hazard. These chemicals were volatile and could explode under certain conditions.
Caused hundreds of deaths. The ammonia, typical, tiniest of leaks, and there's just an explosion waiting to happen. It would wipe everyone in the room out. It's pretty lethal stuff.
Ether will auto-ignite with a temperature of about 160 degrees C, which is quite a low temperature. And actually, there's lots of things in our house that operate with a temperature of 160 degrees C. So switching on a light switch, potentially, could do that.
So when the Edwardians were introducing all sorts of electric items into their homes, they were putting things that could actually set the ether on fire without a naked flame.
That's right. So that's why it's not a good refrigerant for a domestic fridge.
The proud owners of the first fridges, which by then were electric, were paying a small fortune for a product riddled with dangerous design faults. Just as well, fridges didn't go into mass production until the 1950s, by which time the technology could control the chemicals. So what do we use now?
We use HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons. We also use some of the old refrigerants as well still. We use ammonia and carbon dioxide, but we can use them in a better way because we've got better materials to contain them.
They're actually sealed fridges now. The systems are actually a closed loop. So you have a compressor, you have the gases inside there. We're starting to use smaller amounts of the gases. They're more efficient, and as long as you actually sort of dispose of them properly, then they can be okay.
So although they were using dangerous substances, they'd hit on something that really worked.
Absolutely, yeah, that's completely right.